The town believed she ran away, until her necklace was found 28 years later. The rusted hinge of the old jewelry box screamed. Not a creak, not a groan, but a high, thin shriek that sliced through the damp, cloying air of the attic. Elias Thorne, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the smooth, worn wood of a shovel handle than the delicate filigree of forgotten treasures, flinched. He was only here because the bank was foreclosing. His mother, bless her stubborn, fading heart, had finally been moved to the county home, leaving him the grim task of sorting through the layered sediment of a life lived entirely in one small, suffocating town. Dust motes, thick as summer gnats, danced in the single beam of his flashlight, illuminating a landscape of ghosts, piles of yellowed newspapers, a headless doll with one staring blue eye, a stack of vinyl records warped into unplayable smiles. He'd been at it for hours, the sweat on his brow tracing clean paths through the grime on his skin. This box was the last thing, tucked away in a rotted trunk under a pile of moth-eaten blankets that smelled of cedar and decay. He pried the lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a tangle of costume jewelry, gaudy plastic pearls, a rhinestone brooch missing half its stones, a child's silver-plated ring. He sighed, a plume of dust rising from his lips. More junk. He was about to dump the contents into a trash bag when something caught the beam of his light dot. It wasn't the cheap glint of plastic or the dull shine of plated metal. It was a deeper, warmer glow. Gold. Elias reached in, his calloused fingers fumbling through the junk. He pulled it free. It was a necklace, a delicate chain, so fine it seemed like a strand of spun sunlight. And from it hung a single, perfect charm, a tiny, intricately carved hummingbird, its wings frozen mid-flutter. He'd seen it before, a long, long time ago. A lifetime ago. His breath hitched. The air in the attic suddenly felt thin, stolen. The dust motes thickened, swirling like a gathering storm. He knew this necklace. He knew the impossible, heartbreaking curve of the bird's wing, the microscopic ruby that served as its eye. It was hers. Leela. The name was a wound in his memory. A place he hadn't dared to touch in 20 years. Leela Grace, the girl with eyes the color of a summer storm and a laugh that could chase the shadows from any room. The girl who had vanished from the face of the earth one humid August night in 1997. They said she ran away. That's what everyone in Harmony Creek had decided. Sheriff Brody, a man whose investigative skills began and ended with ticketing teenagers for parking too close to the fire hydrant, had declared it so. A wild spirit, that one, he'd said, his voice thick with a condescending pity that made Elias's teenage fists clench. Town like this was never gonna hold her. And everyone had nodded. They wanted to believe it. It was easier. Runaway was a tragedy of wanderlust, a story with an open ending. A missing girl, a taken girl, was a monster in their midst. And Harmony Creek didn't have monsters. It had church picnics and Friday night football and neighbors who left their doors unlocked. But Elias knew. He'd always known. Leela wouldn't have run. Not without her mother's locket, the one she never took off. Not without saying goodbye. To him, they had plans. Plans whispered under a blanket of stars. Plans that involved a beat-up Ford Falcon and a map with a circle drawn around a city they'd only ever seen in movies. She wouldn't have left him behind, and she never would have left this necklace. It was a gift from her grandmother, her most prized possession. She'd once told him it was her good luck charm, the little bird, a promise that she, too, could fly away one day. But on her own terms. With him. His heart, a rusty unused engine, sputtered and kicked into a frantic hammering rhythm. 20 years. 28 years of accepting the unacceptable, of letting the town's comfortable lie become his own suffocating reality. He'd buried his grief under years of hard labor, of silent, lonely nights in the small house his father had left him. He'd watched the world move on, watched Leela's mother wither from a grief that had no name, watched the town forget. But the necklace was a key to a locked room in his soul, a room where a 17-year-old girl was still waiting, and it was here. In his mother's attic, the implication hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Why? Why was it here? His mother had barely known Lila. They'd exchanged pleasantries at the grocery store. A polite nod at church. There was no reason, no earthly reason, for Lila's most precious belonging to be hidden in the dark, forgotten corner of the Thorne family attic. Unless a cold dread, colder than the grave, seeped into his bones. He thought of his mother, not the frail, confused woman in the nursing home, but the woman she'd been. Stern, pious. A woman who saw sin in a shared glance, damnation in a whispered secret. A woman who had always, from the very beginning, disapproved of Lila Grace. "She's not our kind, Elias," she'd say. "Her lips a thin, bloodless line. She'll bring you nothing but trouble." He stumbled back, away from the trunk, his hand clutching the necklace so tightly, the delicate chain bit into his palm. The flashlight beam skidded across the attic, a frantic, panicked eye. It landed on a stack of old photo albums. His mother had documented everything, every birthday, every holiday, every joyless, meticulously arranged family portrait. With trembling hands, he grabbed the top album. The plastic pages were yellowed and brittle. He flipped through them, the images a blur of his own awkward, unhappy childhood. There he was, age 10, with a forced smile and a bad haircut. There, age 14, sullen and gangly. And then, he stopped. The date was written in his mother's neat, spidery script in the margin. August 12, 1997. The day after Lila vanished. The photograph was of their backyard. The grass was a vibrant, almost violent green. His father was standing by the old oak tree, his back to the camera. But it wasn't his father that made Ilias's blood run cold. It was the ground dot at the base of the oak tree. The earth was disturbed. A patch of dark, freshly turned soil, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It was shaped like a promise his mind refused to keep. A shape he'd seen 1,000 times in his work at the town cemetery. He remembered that day. He'd asked his mother what his father was doing. "Just some gardening, dear," she'd said, her voice smooth as glass, her eyes never meeting his. "Fixing a patch where the roses wouldn't take." They didn't have roses in the backyard. They never had. The attic walls seemed to close in, the air thick and unbreathable. The smell of cedar and decay was suddenly the smell of secrets and rot. The shriek of the jewelry box hinge echoed in his ears. A sound of something being torn open. Something that could never be closed again. He looked from the photograph to the hummingbird necklace in his hand. The tiny ruby eye seemed to wink at him, a drop of blood in the dim light. 20-8 years. They hadn't been for nothing. They had been a lie. A carefully constructed, meticulously maintained lie. And his own mother, the woman who had tucked him in at night, the woman who had taught him his prayers, had been its architect. The floorboards groaned under his feet as he scrambled toward the attic stairs. The photo album clutched in one hand, the necklace in the other. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man of 45, with a bad back and a heart full of scar tissue. But, in that moment, as he burst out of the suffocating darkness and into the fading light of the setting sun, he was 17 again. And he was going to find out what happened to Lila Grace, even if it meant digging up every last skeleton in Harmony Creek, starting with the one in his own backyard. The world outside the attic was a different planet. The air was cool and sweet, with the scent of cut grass and impending rain. The setting sun painted the clouds in hues of orange and bruised purple, but Elias saw none of it. His world had shrunk to 2 objects, a photograph and a necklace. Evidence, proof, of what he wasn't yet sure. But it was a truth more real than anything he had known for 28 years. He stumbled down the rickety attic ladder, his boots thudding onto the dusty floor of the upstairs hallway. The house was silent, a tomb of memories. He walked through the rooms, seeing them for the first time. The faded floral wallpaper in the living room, the crucifix hanging over the mantelpiece, the worn armchair where his father used to sit, reading the paper, his face a mask of grim indifference. Every object seemed sinister now, a prop in a play of deception. His mother's bedroom was the worst. It smelled of lavender and mothballs, a scent he'd always associated with comfort, but which now seemed like the cloying perfume of a funeral home. He saw her silver-backed brush on the dresser, her Bible on the nightstand. How could she have slept in this bed, night after night, knowing what she knew? How could she have looked him in the eye, day after day, and said nothing? The rage came. Then, hot and blinding. It was a physical force, a wave that threatened to pull him under. He wanted to smash something, to tear the house apart board by board, to scream until his lungs bled. He clenched his fists, the necklace cutting deeper into his flesh. The pain was a grounding force, an anchor in the storm of his emotions. He had to be smart. He couldn't go to the police, not yet. The new sheriff was a man named Peterson, a transplant from the city who wouldn't know Lila Grace from a hole in the ground. And besides, the ghost of Sheriff Brody still lingered in the town's collective memory. Brody, who had been so quick to close the case, so eager to accept the story of a runaway girl. Brody, who was a close friend of his father's. They played poker together every Thursday night. The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow. His father, a quiet, stoic man who had ruled their home with an iron fist and a leather belt. A man whose temper was a sleeping giant, rarely roused, but terrifying when it was. Elias had always been afraid of him. He'd seen the way his father looked at Lila, a flicker of something dark and possessive in his eyes. He'd dismissed it then as the overprotective glare of a father figure. Now, he saw it for what it was. His mind reeled, trying to piece together the fragments of memory, to see the past through this new, horrifying lens. He remembered the night Lila disappeared. He'd been grounded, confined to his room for staying out too late with her the night before. His father had been the one to deliver the punishment, his voice low and menacing. "You'll stay away from that girl, you hear me? She's trouble," Elias had argued. Of course, he'd yelled, he'd pleaded, and his father had simply locked his bedroom door from the outside. He'd spent the night pacing his room like a caged animal, listening to the sounds of the house. The murmur of his parents' voices downstairs, the slam of the back door, the rumble of his father's truck starting up, then driving away. He'd assumed his father was going to the bar, as he often did after an argument. But what if he wasn't? What if he was going to see Lila? A wave of nausea washed over him. He stumbled into the bathroom and retched into the toilet, his body convulsing with a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing him apart from the inside. It wasn't just the loss of Lila, it was the loss of everything he had ever believed to be true. His childhood, his family, his entire life, was a lie. When the heaving stopped, he splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The man looking back at him was a stranger, his eyes hollowed out by a truth he could no longer escape. The boy who had loved Lila Grace was gone, replaced by this grim, determined man. He had to know for sure. He left the house, the photo album, and the necklace tucked safely inside his jacket. The sun had set, and the first stars were beginning to prick the darkening sky. He got into his truck, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. But he didn't drive to the sheriff's office. He didn't drive to the home of Lila's long-dead mother. He drove to the one place he had avoided for nearly 3 decades. The place where the past was buried. His own backyard. The old oak tree was still there. A massive, gnarled silhouette against the twilight sky. It had been their tree, his and Lila's. He'd carved their initials into its trunk one summer afternoon. A clumsy heart surrounding the letters E.T. plus L.G. He ran his fingers over the scar in the bark, now barely visible, healed over by time, but the wound underneath was still raw. He went to the shed and found what he was looking for, a shovel. The wood of the handle was smooth and familiar in his hands. It was his father's shovel. The same one from the photograph. He walked to the spot at the base of the tree, the place where the roses wouldn't take. The grass was thick and green, no different from the rest of the lawn. But Elias knew. He knew what was underneath. He took a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. And then he began to dig. The first few shovelfuls were easy, the soil soft and loamy. But then he hit something hard. Not a rock, something else. Something that gave way with a sickening, brittle crunch. He dropped to his knees, his heart pounding in his ears. He clawed at the dirt with his bare hands, his fingers scraping against something smooth and cold. Bone dot, he scrambled back, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He shone his phone's flashlight into the shallow grave. It was a skeleton. Small, delicate, the skeleton of a teenage girl. And around the skeletal remains of her neck, glinting in the pale artificial light, was a silver locket. Her mother's locket, the one she never took off. The world tilted on its axis. The trees, the house, the stars, all of it spun into a dizzying, nauseating vortex. He had found her. After 28 years, he had found Lila. She hadn't run away. She had been here all along, buried just a few feet from the room where he slept, under the tree where they had carved their names. The lie was dead. And in its place was a truth so monstrous, so devastating, it threatened to consume him whole. His father, his mother, they had killed her. They had killed the girl he loved, and they had buried her in his own backyard. He didn't know how long he knelt there, staring into the shallow grave, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. Time had ceased to exist. There was only the before, and the now. The before, a lifetime of blissful, ignorant grief, and the now, a nightmare from which he would never wake. Finally, a sound pierced the fog of his shock. A car door slamming. Headlights swept across the lawn, pinning him in their glare. A voice called out, sharp and authoritative. Elias Thorne. This is Sheriff Peterson. Step away from their son, and put your hands where I can see them. He looked up, blinded by the light. He could see the silhouettes of two officers, their guns drawn. Someone must have seen him, a strange man digging in a backyard in the middle of the night, and called, "The police?" He didn't move. He couldn't. He was frozen, a statue of grief and horror. He looked from the grave to the house where his parents had lived, and lied, and murdered. And then he looked down at his hands, caked in the dirt. That had hidden his beloved Leela for 28 years. He was no longer just a grieving lover. He was a witness. He was the keeper of a secret that would tear this town apart. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life would never be the same. The digging had been the easy part. The real work, the work of unearthing the truth, was just beginning. And it would be a bloody, brutal business. The cliffhanger was not just what he had found, but what he would become. He was the storm that was about to break over Harmony Creek, and there would be no shelter from the rain. Lila Grace wasn't a ghost. She was a wildfire. Even in memory she burned too bright. 17, with hair the color of dark honey, and a spray of freckles across her nose that she hated but Elias had loved to count. She wasn't beautiful in the placid porcelain doll way of the other girls in Harmony Creek, the cheerleaders and the preacher's daughters. Her beauty was kinetic, a thing of motion and defiance. It was in the way she threw her head back when she laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer storm. It was in the fierce, intelligent light in her storm-gray eyes, eyes that saw right through the town's polite facades and into the cramped, dusty rooms of its secrets. She lived with her mother, Eleanor, in a small clapboard house on the edge of town, where the manicured lawns gave way to tangled woods. The house always smelled of turpentine and linseed oil. Eleanor was an artist, a painter of moody, abstract landscapes that no one in Harmony Creek understood or wanted to buy. They called her eccentric, a word that in their limited vocabulary meant almost a witch. Eleanor's grief, after Leela's disappearance, had been a terrible, silent thing. She'd stopped painting. The vibrant, chaotic canvases that had once filled her home were replaced by blank white walls. She'd simply faded, like a photograph left in the sun, until she was nothing but a pale outline of the woman she'd once been. She'd died 10 years ago, of what the town doctor called a broken heart. A diagnosis Elias knew to be unequivocally true. Lila had inherited her mother's artistic soul. But her canvas was life itself. She found beauty in the discarded and the broken. She'd take Elias to the town dump, a place of rust and ruin, and see treasures. A shattered piece of blue glass became a fallen star. A twisted bicycle frame was a sleeping metal dragon. She had a way of looking at the world that made it seem bigger, more magical, than it was. It was this quality, this untamable imagination, that both drew people to her and frightened them. She didn't fit into the neat, predictable boxes of Harmony Creek. She was a question mark in a town that only dealt in periods. Her father was a ghost of a different sort. A man who had walked out when she was 6, leaving behind nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a hole in her heart. She tried to fill with bravado and a carefully cultivated indifference. Good riddance, she'd once told Elias, her voice a little too sharp, her gaze fixed on a point just over his shoulder. Who needs a father who can't even remember his own daughter's birthday? But Elias had seen the way she looked at other girls with their fathers, a flicker of longing in her eyes that she quickly extinguished, like a match dropped in the dirt. This ache, this primal wound of abandonment, was the source of her fierce independence, but also her vulnerability. She was desperate to be loved, to be chosen, but terrified of being left behind again. It was why she'd clung to Elias, to their shared dream of escape. He wasn't just her boyfriend. He was her anchor, her promise of a future that wasn't defined by the past. The antagonist in Elias's mind had always been the town itself, its suffocating piety, its small-minded judgments. But now, the monster had a face, and it was the face of his own father. Arthur Thorne was a man carved from granite. He was a deacon at the First Baptist Church, a respected small business owner who ran the town's only hardware store. To the people of Harmony Creek, he was a pillar of the community, a man of unshakable faith and moral certainty. But at home, behind closed doors, he was a different man. His piety was a weapon, his silence a threat. He moved through their small house with a heavy, deliberate tread, as if the very act of existence was a burden he bore with grim resentment. His past was a locked box. He never spoke of his childhood, of his parents, of anything before he arrived in Harmony Creek at the age of 25 and married Elias's mother, a woman 10 years his junior. He had come from somewhere down south. That was all anyone knew. He carried with him an air of coiled violence, a sense that just beneath the surface of his calm, controlled demeanor, a terrible rage was simmering. Elias had felt it as a boy, in the sting of the belt on his bare legs for some minor infraction, in the cold, dead look in his father's eyes when he was disobeyed. Arthur Thorne hated weakness. He hated emotion. He hated anything that he couldn't control, and he had hated Leela Grace with a passion that had frightened Elias even then. He saw in her everything he despised. Her freedom, her defiance, her raw, unfiltered emotion. She was a spark of chaos in his carefully ordered world. He'd forbid Elias from seeing her, his voice a low, guttural growl. That girl is poison. She will ruin you. But it was more than just parental disapproval. There was a possessiveness to his hatred, a strange, obsessive quality that Elias hadn't understood at the time. He'd watch her from the window. When she came to the house, his eyes narrowed, his jaw tight. It wasn't the look of a concerned father. It was the look of a predator. And then there was the hidden witness. His mother, Mary Thorne, was a woman who lived in fear. Fear of God, fear of her husband, fear of the judgment of her neighbors. She was a ghost in her own home, a pale, silent figure who drifted from room to room, cleaning, cooking, praying. Her life was a small, circumscribed circle of duty and obligation. She had been a pretty girl once. Elias had seen the pictures. A girl with a shy smile and hopeful eyes. But marriage to Arthur Thorne had extinguished that light, leaving behind a woman who was little more than a hollow shell. Her secret was not one of action, but of inaction. Her sin was one of silence. She saw everything. She saw the way her husband looked at Leela. She saw the bruises on Elias's back. She saw the darkness that lived in the heart of their home. But she said nothing. Her complicity was a form of survival. To speak out would have been to invite the wrath of her husband, to shatter the fragile illusion of their perfect Christian family. And so she had chosen silence. She had chosen to be a witness to the slow, creeping horror that had unfolded under her own roof. The night Leela disappeared, Elias remembered hearing them argue. His mother's voice, usually so timid, was raised in a rare show of defiance. Couldn't make out the words, only the sharp, pleading tone. And then his father's voice, a low, menacing rumble that cut through the floorboards and made the hair on Elias's arms stand on end. Then, silence. The slam of the back door. The sound of the truck. He had thought it was about him, about his punishment, but now he knew. It was about Lila. His mother had tried, in her own weak, ineffectual way, to stop him. And she had failed. The next morning, the house was unnaturally quiet. His father was gone, supposedly on an early morning fishing trip, something he had never done before. His mother was in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling as she washed the dishes. She wouldn't look at him. When he asked where his father was, she had simply said he needed some time to cool off. And then, there was the gardening. The patch of freshly turned earth by the old oak tree. She had lied to him, her voice as smooth and practiced as a Sunday sermon. Just fixing a patch where the roses wouldn't take, a lie she had maintained for 28 years. A lie that had protected her husband and condemned a 17-year-old girl to a secret, unmarked grave. These were the characters in the tragedy. The vibrant, defiant victim. The cold, tyrannical antagonist. And the silent, complicit witness. A toxic triangle of desire, control, and fear that had culminated in a single horrific act of violence. As Elias sat in the back of the police car, the red and blue lights flashing across his face, he saw them all with a terrible crystalline clarity. He saw Lila laughing, her head thrown back, the hummingbird necklace glinting at her throat. He saw his father, his face a mask of cold fury, his hands clenched into fists. And he saw his mother, her eyes wide with a terror she would never voice, her hands clasped in a prayer that would never be answered. The town of Harmony. Creek had believed a story for 28 years, a simple, comfortable story about a girl who ran away. But the truth was far more complex, far more monstrous. It was a story of secrets and lies, of love and obsession, of a darkness that had festered in the heart of a seemingly perfect family. And Elias Thorne, the boy who had loved the runaway girl, was now the man who would have to tell it. He was the sole survivor of a shipwreck that had happened a lifetime ago. And he had finally washed ashore, clutching the wreckage of the past in his hands. The storm was here, and its name was Truth. The interrogation room was a sterile beige box, smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was a place designed to strip you of your identity, to make you feel small and insignificant. But Elias felt anything but small. He felt like a giant, swollen with a grief and rage so immense it threatened to shatter the cinderblock walls. Sheriff Peterson sat across from him, a man with a tired, patient face and eyes that had seen too much. He slid a styrofoam cup of coffee across the metal table. Elias ignored it. Mr. Thorne, Peterson began, his voice a low, even baritone. I need you to tell me what happened tonight. From the beginning. Elias looked at the sheriff, really looked at him. He wasn't Brody, he wasn't part of the old guard. The good old boys who had buried the truth along with Leela. He was an outsider. A man who might just be capable of seeing what everyone else had refused to see. So he told him. He told him everything. He told him about Leela, about their plans, about the night she disappeared. He told him about his father, about his coldness, his cruelty, his obsessive hatred of the girl his son loved. He told him about his mother, about her fear, her silence, her lies. And he told him about the necklace. He pulled it from his pocket, the delicate gold chain pooling in his palm like liquid light. He laid it on the table, the tiny hummingbird a silent, irrefutable witness. Then he pulled out the photo album, opened to the page with the picture of his father and the freshly turned earth. Peterson stared at the evidence, his face unreadable. He picked up the necklace, turning it over in his fingers. He looked at the photograph, his eyes lingering on the dark patch of soil. For a long time, he said nothing. The only sound in the room was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, he looked up, his gaze meeting Ilias's. "Your father, Arthur Thorne, passed away 5 years ago, is that correct?" "Yes," Elias said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "heart attack." "And your mother, Mary Thorne, is currently a resident at the Harmony Creek Assisted Living Facility." "Yes, she has dementia." Peterson leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his tired face. "So the only person who can corroborate your story, the only person who can tell us what really happened that night, is a woman who may not even remember her own name." "She remembers," Elias said, a sudden fierce conviction in his voice. "She has to. Some things you can't forget." The sheriff was silent for another long moment. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. "We've secured the scene. The forensics team is on its way from the city. We'll excavate the site properly, identify the remains. But Mr. Thorne, I need you to understand what you're doing. You're accusing your own father of murder. You're accusing your own mother of being an accessory. You're about to tear this town apart." "This town was torn apart 28 years ago," Elias said, his voice shaking with a rage that was centuries old. "They just didn't know it yet." The visit to the nursing home was like stepping into a waking dream. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. The residents drifted through the hallways like pale, bewildered ghosts, their eyes fixed on a past that was more real to them than the present. Elias found his mother in the common room, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at a bird feeder. She was a tiny, frail thing, her hair as white and fine as spun silk. Her hands, twisted with arthritis, lay still in her lap. She didn't look up as he approached. "Mum," he said, his voice gentle. She turned her head slowly, her eyes, a faded, watery blue, struggling to focus. For a moment, there was no recognition in them, and then, a flicker. "Elias, is that you, dear? You're late. Your father will be angry." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She was back there, back in that house, in that life, trapped in the amber of her memory. "Dad's not here, Mum," he said, pulling up a chair beside her. "It's just us," she frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "Arthur is always here. He's in the garden, fixing a patch." For the roses, Ilias's blood ran cold, she remembered. It was right there, on the surface, a piece of a puzzle she didn't even know she was holding. He took a deep breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the necklace. He held it out to her, the hummingbird dangling from its chain. "Mum," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you remember this?" She stared at the necklace, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her hand, gnarled and trembling, reached out and touched the tiny gold bird. A shiver ran through her frail body, and then, her eyes cleared. The fog of dementia lifted, and for a fleeting, terrible moment, she was lucid. The fear that had been her constant companion for so many years flooded her face. "Stark and raw, Leela's," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound. "Oh God," he took it from her. He said it was a sin, a vanity, he said. She was a temptress, sent by the devil to lead you astray. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her eyes darted around the room, as if expecting to see her husband's ghost appear in the doorway. "He went to her that night," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I tried to stop him, I begged him, but he wouldn't. Listen, he said he was going to save your soul, Elias. He was going to save you from her." She began to weep, silent, racking sobs that shook her entire body. "He came back late. There was dirt under his fingernails, and blood on his shirt. He made me burn it. He said she was gone, that she had run away, and we were never to speak her name again." She looked at Elias, her eyes pleading, desperate for an absolution he could not give. "I was so afraid," she whispered. He would have hurt me. He would have hurt you. I did it to protect you, Elias. I did it all to protect you." The confession hung in the air between them, a toxic, shimmering thing. It was everything he had suspected, everything he had feared. It was the truth, in all its ugly, heartbreaking detail. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't offer her comfort. He couldn't offer her forgiveness. All he could do was sit there, his hand covering hers, and let her weep for the girl she had let die. For the son whose life she had destroyed, for the long, terrible secret that had finally, after 20 years, come into the light. The characters were no longer just memories. They were present, their actions and inactions laid bare in the sterile antiseptic air of the nursing home. The stage was set. The play was about to begin, and the entire town of Harmony Creek was about to become its unwilling audience. News travels fast in a small town, but in Harmony Creek, it moved with the speed and destructive force of a flash flood. The discovery in the Thorne backyard wasn't just a story. It was a seismic event, a crack in the very foundation of their shared reality. The official confirmation that the remains were, indeed, those of Lila Grace, was a mere formality. The town had already convicted Arthur Thorne in the court of public opinion. The pillar of the community, the man of God, was a monster. The reaction was a strange, volatile cocktail of horror, fascination, and a perverse sort of civic pride. Harmony Creek was no longer just a sleepy, forgotten town. It was the setting of a real-life murder mystery, a place worthy of newsvans and reporters with microphones and grim, serious faces. The street where Elias lived was cordoned off with yellow police tape, a constant lurid reminder of the secret it had kept for so long. People would drive by slowly, their faces pressed to the car windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would connect them to the unfolding drama. For Elias, the town's newfound attention was a suffocating shroud. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, the quiet man who ran the hardware store his father had left him. He was a character in their story, the grieving lover, the avenging son, the man who had dug up his own past. They stared at him in the grocery store, their eyes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They whispered behind their hands as he walked down the street. He was a living, breathing ghost, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their placid lives. The conflict, however, was not just with the prying eyes of the town. It was with the institution that was supposed to protect them. The Harmony Creek First Baptist Church, the spiritual and social center of the town, was in full damage control mode. Arthur Thorne had been one of them, a deacon, a leader. His sin was a stain on their collective righteousness, and they were desperate to wash it clean. Pastor Miller, a man with a booming voice and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, paid Elias a visit. He sat in Elias's living room, the same room where his father had sat, and spoke in hushed, pious tones. "Elias, my son," he began, his hands clasped together, as if in prayer. "The whole community is grieving with you. To think that our brother Arthur was capable of such a terrible thing. It's a test of our faith." Elias said nothing. He just stared at the pastor, his face a mask of cold fury. "The church," Miller continued, "wants to help you heal. We want to help the town heal. We are planning a memorial service for young Leela, a chance for the community to come together, to find closure. Elias's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "You want closure? Arthur Thorne was a deacon in your church for 30 years. He sat in your pews, he listened to your sermons, he shook your hand every Sunday, and none of you, not a single one of you, saw the monster he was." Pastor Miller's smile faltered. "We can't know what is in a man's heart, Elias. Only God can judge. God didn't bury a 17-year-old girl in my backyard." Elias shot back, his voice rising. "Arthur Thorne did. And this town, this church, you all helped him. You helped him by looking the other way, by believing the lie because it was easier than the truth. You want to have a memorial service, fine, but you'll do it after the trial. After everyone knows exactly what he did. After everyone knows what she did." The pastor's face hardened. "Your mother is a sick woman, Elias. A confused, elderly woman who is not responsible for her words. To drag her name through the mud, to tarnish the memory of your father. It's a cruel and vengeful act. It is not the Christian way. The Christian way. Elias laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Tell me, Pastor, is it the Christian way to protect a murderer? Is it the Christian way to silence a victim? My mother may be sick, but she told the truth. And I will not let you or anyone else bury it again. The battle lines were drawn. The church, in its desperate attempt to protect its reputation, began to subtly, insidiously, discredit Elias and his mother. Rumors began to circulate that Elias was unstable, driven by a lifelong resentment of his father. That his mother's confession was nothing more than the ramblings of a senile old woman, her mind poisoned by grief and dementia. They painted Arthur Thorne not as a monster, but as a tragic, misunderstood figure, a man who had been pushed to the brink by a wild, promiscuous girl. They resurrected the old whispers about Leela, that she was fast, that she was trouble, that she had a reputation. They twisted her vibrant, defiant spirit into something ugly and sinister. She was no longer the victim. She was the seductress, the temptress who had led a good man astray. It was the classic, time-honored defense of the indefensible. Blame the victim. Elias found himself isolated, a pariah in his own town. Old friends crossed the street to avoid him. The regulars at the hardware store stopped coming in. He was a threat to their comfortable, carefully constructed world. He was forcing them to look at the ugliness they had ignored for so long, and they hated him for it. The cruelty was not just in the whispers and the rumors. It was in the small, deliberate acts of malice. A rock thrown through the window of his store. A spray-painted slur on his front door. Liar, his father's grave in the church cemetery, was desecrated. The headstone toppled over, the grass torn up. It was a message, clear and unambiguous. Let the dead rest. Let the past stay buried. The witness, his mother, was also under attack. The church elders tried to have her declared mentally incompetent, to have her confession thrown out as unreliable. They sent a lawyer to the nursing home, a smooth, slick man who tried to bully and confuse her, to twist her words and make her doubt her own memory. But the attack on his mother had an unintended consequence. It hardened Elias's resolve. It turned his grief into a cold, diamond-hard fury. He was no longer just seeking justice for Lila. He was fighting for his mother, for the broken, terrified woman who had finally, after a lifetime of silence, found the courage to speak the truth. He hired a lawyer of his own, a young, ambitious woman from the city named Sarah Jenkins. She was sharp, tenacious, and unimpressed by the small-town politics of Harmony Creek. She saw the case for what it was, not just a murder, but a conspiracy of silence. They're trying to build a narrative, she told him. Her office, a stark contrast to the folksy wood-paneled world of Harmony Creek. They're putting Lila on trial. They're going to paint her as a teenage Jezebel, and your father as a pillar of the community who snapped. We need to fight back. We need to remind people who the real victim is. The conflict escalated. Sarah filed a motion to have Arthur Thorne's body exhumed, to search for any evidence that might have been missed in the original, cursory autopsy. The church fought it, tooth and nail. The idea of digging up their sainted deacon was a sacrilege, a desecration. The battle raged in the courtroom, a proxy war for the soul of the town. Elias felt like he was drowning. The pressure was immense. The weight of the past, a crushing burden. He was haunted by dreams of Leela, of her laughter, of her touch. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, the ghost of her name on his lips. He was fighting for her, but he was losing himself in the process. One night, unable to sleep, he drove out to the old clapboard house where Lila had lived. It was abandoned now, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling. He walked through the overgrown yard, the weeds tangling around his ankles. He stood on the porch, the wood groaning under his weight. He could almost hear the echo of her laughter, see the flicker of light in the window of her room. He felt a hand on his shoulder and spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. It was Sheriff Peterson. "Can't sleep either, huh?" the sheriff said, his voice quiet. Elias shook his head, unable to speak. "It's a tough thing you're doing, son," Peterson said, looking out at the dark, silent woods. "Taking on your own family. taking on the whole town. I don't have a choice, Elias whispered. I know. The sheriff paused, his gaze fixed on the dilapidated house. You know, when I first took this job, I read through all the old cold cases. Just to get a feel for the place. I read Lila Grace's file. It was thin, too thin. Brody closed it in less than a week. He interviewed a few of her friends, your parents, and that was it. He wrote in his report that she was prone to melodrama, and had a history of running away. But there was no history. She'd never run away before. Not once. Peterson turned to look at Elias, his eyes hard in the moonlight. Brody didn't want to find her. He was friends with your father. They were hunting buddies. He was protecting him. The whole damn town was protecting him. The words hung in the air, a confirmation of the ugly truth Elias had long suspected. It wasn't just his father's sin. It was the town's. We won the motion, Peterson said, his voice low. The judge ordered the exhumation. We're digging him up tomorrow. The news should have been a victory, but it felt like another descent into hell. They were literally unearthing the monster. The next day, Elias stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching as the forensics team worked under a cold, grey sky. The town had turned out to watch, a silent, grim-faced crowd gathered behind the police tape. Pastor Miller was there, his face a thunderous mask of disapproval, as they lifted the casket from the earth. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It felt like a violation, a disturbance of a sacred peace. But Elias knew there was no peace here, only secrets. He watched as they opened the casket, and then he saw it, something that made his blood run cold. On the third finger of his father's skeletal hand, there was a ring. A simple, silver-plated ring. A child's ring. Elias recognized it instantly. It was the ring he had seen in the old jewelry box in his mother's attic. The ring that had been tangled up with Lila's necklace. But that was impossible. He had the ring. He had taken it from the box. He had it in his pocket right now. He reached into his pocket, his hand trembling. He pulled it out. It was identical. And then he understood. It wasn't the same ring. It was a matching one. His mind flashed back to a memory, a fragment he hadn't thought of in years. He and Lila, sitting by the creek, a few weeks before she disappeared. She had been excited, showing him something she'd found at a flea market. A set of matching best friend rings. Cheap, silly things. She'd given him one, and kept the other. He'd lost his a few days later, and had forgotten all about it. But Lila hadn't forgotten. And his father had taken it. From her, a trophy. A sick, twisted memento of his conquest. The conflict was no longer just about justice. It was about possession. His father hadn't just killed Lila, he had tried to own her, to erase her, to take her place in Elias's life. The ring was a symbol of that twisted, possessive rage. The escalating conflict had reached its peak. The battle was no longer just against the town, or the church, or the memory of his father. It was against the man himself, a man so consumed by hatred and jealousy that his evil had reached out from beyond the grave. Elias looked at the ring on his father's hand, and then at the one in his own. He was no longer just fighting for Lila, he was fighting for his own soul. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was a fight he could not afford to lose. The discovery of the ring was a bombshell. But it was one that exploded in silence. To the forensics team, it was just another piece of evidence to be bagged and tagged. To the town, it was an unseen detail, a secret that remained buried with the man in the casket. Only Elias understood its terrible significance. It was a personal message from the grave, a final, taunting act of possession from his father. The exhumation yielded little else. Arthur Thorne had died of a heart attack, just as the original death certificate had stated. There were no signs of a struggle, no DNA evidence under his fingernails that could be tied to Lila. The case against him, and by extension, his mother, still rested on the fragile foundation of a decades-old memory and a dying woman's confession. Sarah Jenkins was pragmatic. "The ring helps," she said, her voice crisp and professional over the phone. "It establishes a connection, a trophy-taking element that speaks to his psychology, but it's circumstantial. The defense will argue that Lila could have given it to him, that they had some kind of secret relationship. They're still going to paint her as the aggressor, the temptress. The word trial loomed over Harmony Creek like a gathering storm cloud. The town was divided, families split, friendships fractured. You were either with Elias, or you were against him. There was no middle ground. The church, led by the increasingly militant Pastor Miller, had doubled down on its defense of Arthur Thorne's memory. They held prayer vigils, not for Lila, but for the slandered soul of their fallen deacon. They were rewriting history in real time, transforming a murderer into a martyr. Elias felt himself sinking, pulled under by the weight of it all. The hardware store was failing. His days were spent in meetings with Sarah, going over the painful details of his past, reopening wounds he had thought long. His nights were sleepless, haunted by the faces of the dead. He was fighting a war on two fronts, a legal battle for justice, and a personal battle against the ghosts of his own family. He had to get out, just for a few hours. He needed air, he needed space, he needed to escape the suffocating confines of the town and its endless whispering judgment. He drove out to the state park, a place he and Lila used to go to escape. He parked his truck and walked, following a familiar trail that led to a small, secluded waterfall. This was their spot. They had spent countless hours here, talking, dreaming, planning their future. It was here that Leela had given him the ring. He could almost see her, sitting on the sun-warmed rocks, her feet dangling in the cool, clear water. Her laughter echoing through the trees. The pain of the memory was so intense it brought him to his knees. He sat on the ground, the damp earth seeping through his jeans, and let the grief wash over him. He had come here to escape, but there was no escape. The past was everywhere. As he sat there, his eyes fell on a familiar shape carved into the bark of a large beech tree. It was the same clumsy heart he had carved into the oak tree in his backyard. The same initials, E.T. plus L.G. He ran his fingers over the scar, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. And then he saw it. Just below their initials, almost hidden by the gnarled bark, was another carving. It was small, barely noticeable. A single, perfect hummingbird. He stared at it, his heart pounding. He didn't remember carving that. Lila must have done it. It was her symbol, her signature. He traced the outline of the bird with his finger, and as he did, he felt something give way. A small section of the bark, no bigger than his thumb, came loose. Behind it, there was a hollow space. His breath hitched. With trembling fingers, he reached into the small cavity. His fingers closed around something hard and rectangular. He pulled it out. It was a microcassette tape. He stared at it, his mind reeling. A microcassette, the kind used in small handheld recorders. Why would this be here, hidden in their secret spot? He remembered Lila had bought a recorder a few months before she disappeared. She was fascinated by the idea of capturing sounds, the waterfall, the birdsong, the whispers of the wind. She called it her sound diary. He had teased her about it, but she had been serious, carrying it with her everywhere. He had to listen to it. He had to know what was on this tape. He scrambled back to his truck, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key in the ignition. He tore through his glove compartment, his center console, looking for something, anything, that could play the tape. He finally found it. An old, dusty Walkman, a relic from a bygone era, tucked away in a box of junk in the back of his truck. It had a cassette player. With fumbling fingers, he inserted the microcassette into an adapter and slid it into the Walkman. He put on the headphones, the cheap foam pressing against his ears. He took a deep breath and pressed play. The sound of static filled his ears, and then, a voice. Lila's voice. August 10th, 1997. Sound diary, entry, I don't know, 20:30. I've lost count. Her voice was a whisper, laced with a nervous energy that made the hair on Elias's arms stand on end. I'm at the waterfall. Our spot. I'm supposed to be meeting Elias, but he's late. Grounded again because of me, she sighed. A sound that was both sad and frustrated. His father, he scares me. The way he looks at me. It's not normal, it's hungry. I told Elias, but he doesn't see it. He thinks he's just being an overprotective dad, but it's more than that. I feel like he's watching me. All the time. The sound of the waterfall, a gentle rushing sound, filled the silence. I saw him today, she continued, her voice dropping even lower. Arthur, I was walking home from school, and he was there. Parked in his truck, just down the street from my house. He didn't see me, he was just watching, waiting. It was creepy. I don't know what to do. I don't want to scare Elias, but I'm scared. Ilias's blood ran cold. She knew. She had been afraid of him, and he hadn't listened. The tape continued. The sound of footsteps, a twig snapping. And then, another voice. A man's voice, his father's voice. Lila, what are you doing? Out here all alone. Elias ripped the headphones from his ears, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like he was going to be sick. It was them, his father and Lila together, and she had recorded it. He forced himself to put the headphones back on. He had to hear it. He had to know. I was just enjoying the quiet. Lila's voice was shaky, trying to sound brave. You shouldn't be out here by yourself, Arthur said, his voice a smooth, oily purr that made Ilias's skin crawl. It's not safe for a pretty girl like you. I'm fine, Mr. Thorne, I was just leaving. No, don't go, stay. Talk to me. There was a pause. I know you're planning on leaving Lila, taking my son away from me. We're not. We were just talking about it. It's just a dream. It's more than a dream. It's a sin. You're filling his head with poison. You're a temptress, a Jezebel, sent to lead him down the path of ruin. His voice was losing its smooth veneer, the rage underneath beginning to break through. That's not true. Lila's voice was defiant now. We love each other. Love. Arthur laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You don't know the first thing about love. You know about lust. You know about manipulation. You're just like your mother. A whore who doesn't know her place. Don't you talk about my mother? I'll talk about her however I please. And I'll talk about you. You think you can just waltz in and take my son, my family, everything I've built. You are a disease, Lila, and I am the cure. There was the sound of a struggle. A muffled scream, Lila's voice, terrified. Get away from me. Let go of me. And then, his father's voice, no longer human, a guttural snarl of pure, undiluted rage. You will not take him from me. You will not ruin my family. You will not ruin my life. The sound of a blow. A sickening, wet thud. And then, silence. A terrible, profound silence, broken only by the gentle, indifferent sound of the waterfall. Elias sat in his truck, the headphones still pressed to his ears, the silence screaming at him. He was paralyzed, frozen in a state of shock so profound it was almost peaceful. He had just listened to the murder of the girl he loved. He had just borne witness to the last moments of her life. The tape wasn't just a clue. It was the whole story. It was the truth, raw and unfiltered. It was the voice of the victim, reaching out from beyond the grave. It was the confession of the murderer, captured in all his monstrous glory. The plot had twisted. This was no longer about a circumstantial case built on a dying woman's memory. This was about a recording. A secret diary. A confession from the killer himself. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about personal pain anymore. It was about public scandal. The sainted deacon of the First Baptist Church, the pillar of the community, caught on tape. His evil laid bare for all to hear. The tension, which had been a slow, simmering burn, had just been cranked to the maximum. Elias held the tape in his hand, a tiny, fragile piece of plastic that held the power to destroy a man's legacy. To shatter a town's illusions, and to finally, after 28 long years, give a voice to the dead. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The time for grief was over. The time for fighting was now. He started the truck, the engine roaring to life, and drove back towards town, back towards the war. He had the weapon he needed, and he was going to burn it all to the ground. The courtroom was a pressure cooker. Every seat was filled. The air was thick with anticipation, a toxic blend of morbid curiosity and self-righteous judgment. The entire town of Harmony Creek, it seemed, was crammed into the stuffy, wood-paneled room. Their faces a sea of pale, upturned masks. On one side sat the church elders, a phalanx of grim-faced men in dark suits, flanking Pastor Miller, who looked as if he were presiding over a funeral. On the other side, there was only Elias, alone at the plaintiff's table, with Sarah Jenkins by his side. The trial had been a brutal, ugly affair. The defense, led by a high-priced lawyer from the city, had done exactly what Sarah had predicted. They had put Lila on trial. They had dragged her name through the mud, painting her as a manipulative, promiscuous teenager who had driven a good man to a moment of madness. They had called witnesses, old high school classmates, disgruntled neighbors, who testified to her wildness, her disrespect for authority. They were trying to poison the jury, to make them believe that she had, in some way, deserved what had happened to her. And then they had attacked his mother. They had brought in so-called experts who testified to the unreliability of memories tainted by dementia. They had twisted her words, her grief, her fear, into the confused ramblings of a senile old woman. They were trying to erase her, to silence her. Just as her husband had done for so many years. Elias had sat through it all. His hands clenched into fists under the table, a cold, silent rage building inside him. He had listened to the lies, the whispers, the character assassination. He had watched as the man who had murdered the love of his life was transformed into a victim, a tragic hero. But he had the tape, and he had been waiting. Sarah had saved it for the perfect moment, the climax, the final, devastating blow. She called her last witness. The prosecution calls Elias Thorne to the stand. A murmur went through the courtroom as Elias walked to the witness box. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, dissecting him, judging him. He sat down, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Sarah began her questioning, her voice calm and steady. She had him recount the story one more time. The discovery of the necklace, the photograph, the shallow grave in his backyard, his mother's confession. With each word, he could feel the mood in the courtroom shifting, the smug certainty on the faces of the church elders beginning to waver. Then came the cross-examination. The defense attorney, a man with a cruel, sneering mouth, approached him like a predator circling its prey. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You expect this jury to believe this fantastic story, that your father, a respected deacon, a beloved member of this community, was a cold-blooded killer, and that your mother, a devout Christian woman, was his accomplice." "I expect the jury to believe the truth," Elias said, his voice even the truth. The lawyer sneered. "The truth is, you hated your father, didn't you? You resented his authority. You were a rebellious, difficult child. I loved a girl my father didn't approve of. That's not the same as hating him. And this girl," the lawyer said, pacing in front of the jury box, "this Lila Grace, she was no angel, was she? She had a reputation, she was known to be adventurous. She was 17, Elias said, his voice tight. She was full of life. Your client's father took that life from her. My client's father is not on trial here." The lawyer thundered. "A dead man is a man who cannot defend himself against these vicious, unsubstantiated allegations, based on the ramblings of a senile old woman and the bitter resentment of a vengeful son." He turned to the jury, his arms outstretched. "There is no evidence, no proof, nothing but the word of a man who has every reason to lie." He turned back to Elias, a triumphant smirk on his face. "No further questions, Your Honor." Elias felt a surge of despair. The lawyer was good. He was twisting everything, making him sound like a liar, a fantasist. He looked at the jury, at their closed, skeptical faces. He was losing them, but then Sarah stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound confidence. "The prosecution has one final piece of evidence to present." walked to the clerk's table and picked up a small, portable cassette player. She placed it on the table in front of the witness box, facing the jury. "What is this, Ms. Jenkins?" the judge asked, a note of impatience in his voice. "It's a diary, Your Honor," Sarah said. "Leela Grace's diary." A gasp went through the courtroom. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection. This is a surprise. We were not made aware of any diary. It was discovered after the evidence submission deadline." "Your Honor," Sarah said smoothly. "And it is not a written diary. It's a sound diary, an audio recording. Made by Leela Grace herself. The last entry was made on August 10, 1997. The day she died." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. The defense attorney was apoplectic, sputtering objections. But the judge, his curiosity piqued, overruled him. "Let's hear it." Sarah looked at Elias. He nodded, his heart in his throat. This was it. She pressed play. The sound of the waterfall filled the courtroom. A gentle rushing sound that was suddenly, terribly ominous. And then, Lila's voice. A ghost in the machine. The courtroom was silent, spellbound. They listened as Lila spoke of her fear, of her love for Elias, of the man who was stalking her. They heard the hope in her voice, and the terror. It was as if she were right there, in the room with them, telling her own story. Elias watched the faces in the jury box. Their skepticism was melting away, replaced by a dawning horror. He watched Pastor Miller, his face ashen, his hands gripping the back of the pew in front of him. He watched the townspeople, their mouths agape, their eyes wide with a terrible understanding, and then came his father's voice, smooth, menacing, evil. The transformation in the courtroom was instantaneous. The air crackled with a palpable shock. This was not the man they knew. This was not the sainted deacon. This was a monster. They listened, in horrified silence, to the confrontation, to the threats, to the rage, to Lila's terrified pleas, and then, the sound of the blow, the sickening wet thud that had haunted Elias's dreams. A woman in the jury box screamed. Someone else sobbed. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of pure, unadulterated horror. Sarah pressed stop. The gentle hiss of the empty tape was the only sound in the room. No one moved, no one spoke. They were all frozen, trapped in the echo of that final, terrible sound. Elias looked at the defense attorney. The man was pale, his face slick with sweat. His sneer was gone, replaced by a look of utter defeat. He had been so sure of his victory, so confident in his ability to manipulate the truth. But he had been silenced. Silenced by the voice of a dead girl. The judge, his face a mask of grim disbelief, cleared his throat. "The court will take a brief recess." But no one moved. They were all looking at Elias. Not with pity anymore. Not with suspicion. But with a kind of awe. He had done it. He had fought the entire town, his own family, the church, and he had won. He had brought the truth out of the darkness and into the light. The cinematic payoff was not a shout, but a whisper. It was the sound of a dead girl's voice, echoing across a span of 28 years. It was the sound of a lie being shattered. It was the sound of justice, finally being served. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was a formality. While Arthur Thorne could not be tried, the civil suit found him responsible for the wrongful death of Leela Grace. His estate, the hardware store, the house, everything he had built, was awarded to Elias, as Leela's intended beneficiary. But it wasn't about the money, it was about the name, his father's name, the name that had been synonymous with piety and respectability in Harmony Creek for half a century, was now synonymous with murder. As Elias left the courtroom, he was mobbed by reporters, their cameras flashing, their microphones shoved in his face, but he ignored them. He walked through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the faces of the townspeople. They looked away, unable to meet his gaze. They were ashamed. Ashamed of their blindness, of their complicity, of the lie they had been so willing to believe. He saw Pastor Miller, standing alone by the courthouse steps, his face a mask of broken pride. The pastor looked at Elias, his eyes full of a strange new emotion. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hatred, it was fear. The fear of a man who has looked into the abyss and seen his own reflection. Elias walked past him without a word. He had nothing. To say the truth had been spoken, and it was louder than any sermon. He got into his truck and drove away, leaving the courthouse, the reporters, the town, behind him. He didn't know where he was going, he just drove. He found himself back at the waterfall, their spot. He sat on the rocks, the cassette player in his hand. He didn't play it again. He didn't need to. The words were burned into his memory. He had won. He had gotten justice for Lila. He had exposed the monster and shattered the lie. It should have felt like a victory. But it didn't. It just felt empty. He had spent 28 years grieving a girl who had run away. He had spent the last few months fighting for a girl who had been murdered. But he had never had the chance to just miss her. The real her. The girl who laughed like wind chimes, who saw dragons in bicycle frames, who carved hummingbirds into trees. The public justice had been served. The explosive, shocking, emotionally cathartic moment had passed. The town of Harmony Creek would never be the same. But as Elias sat by the waterfall, listening to the gentle, indifferent rush of the water, he knew that his own healing had just begun. The cinematic payoff was over. And now, he was left alone with the ghosts. The trial was over, but the echoes remained. Harmony Creek was a town in mourning. Not for the sainted deacon it had lost, but for the innocence it had pretended to have. For so long, the thorn house, the hardware store, the pew where Arthur had sat every Sunday, they were all monuments to a lie. And the townspeople couldn't look at them without a shiver of collective guilt. The story of Leela Grace was no longer a whispered rumor. It was a cautionary tale, a dark legend woven into the fabric of the town's history. Elias sold the house. He couldn't live there anymore, couldn't sleep in a room just yards from where Leela had been buried. He sold the hardware store. He couldn't bear to stand behind the counter where his father had stood, to touch the tools his father had touched. He took the money, the hollow victory prize from his civil suit, and he gave it all away. He established a scholarship in name at the local high school, an arts scholarship for students with a wild spirit and an untamable imagination. It was a small gesture, a quiet act of rebellion against the town that had tried so hard to crush her spirit. He visited his mother one last time. She was lost again, adrift in the fog of her dementia. She didn't remember the trial, didn't remember her confession. She only remembered her husband, her fear, and the roses that wouldn't take. She looked at Elias with pleading, confused eyes, and asked him if her Arthur would be home for dinner. Elias kissed her on the forehead, a gesture of forgiveness. He wasn't sure he felt, and walked away. He couldn't save her. He couldn't even hate her. She was just another victim of the man who had destroyed them all. She died a few months later, in her sleep. A quiet end to a life of silent torment. Elias left Harmony Creek. He packed a single bag, got in his truck, and drove west, with no destination in mind. He was running, not from the past, but from the man he had become. The avenging son. The keeper of secrets. The ghost hunter. He didn't want to be that man anymore. He just wanted to be Elias. He drove for days, through towns that all looked the same, through landscapes that blurred into a meaningless green and brown. He was adrift, a man without an anchor. The justice he had fought so hard for had not brought him peace. It had only hollowed him out, leaving him with nothing but the ghosts of his memories. He ended up in a small, coastal town in Oregon, a place where the sky was always gray and the air smelled of salt and rain. He rented a small cabin on a cliff overlooking the ocean, a wild, tumultuous expanse of water that mirrored the storm inside him. He spent his days walking on the beach, watching the waves crash against the rocks, feeling the cold, clean wind. On his face he thought about Leela constantly. Not the victim, not the ghost, but the girl. He remembered the way she would scrunch up her nose when she was thinking, the way she would bite her lip when she was trying not to laugh. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, the sound of her voice whispering secrets in the dark. He was finally allowing himself to grieve, not for the life she had lost, but for the life they had lost together. One day, as he was walking on the beach, he saw something glinting in the wet sand. He bent down and picked it up. It was a piece of sea glass, worn smooth and opaque by the relentless tumbling of the waves. It was a deep, stormy gray, the exact color of Leela's eyes. He held it in his palm, the glass cool and smooth against his skin. And for the first time since he had found her necklace in that dusty attic, he wept. He wept for the boy he had been, and the man he had become. He wept for the love he had lost, and the future that had been stolen from them. He wept until he had no tears left, until he was just a man on a deserted beach, clutching a piece of glass, his heart as empty and vast as the ocean in front of him. The weeping was a cleansing, a letting go. He couldn't bring her back. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose how he lived with it. He went back to his cabin and took out the old jewelry box he had brought with him from his mother's attic. He opened it. Inside, nestled on the faded velvet, were the two things he had left of her, the hummingbird necklace and the cheap silver-plated ring. He took the piece of sea glass and placed it in the box with them. A fallen star, a captured storm, a memory of her. Magic. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever find peace, if the ghosts would ever truly leave him. But as he stood on the cliff, watching the sun set over the ocean, painting the grey water in hues of orange and bruised purple, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. He had survived. He had borne witness. He had spoken the truth. And in the end, that was all he could do. The emotional aftermath was not a neat and tidy healing. It was a haunting reflection, a bittersweet acceptance of the cost of truth. The final image was not of a grave marker or a memorial, but of a man, alone, standing on the edge of a continent, holding the fragmented pieces of a love story that had been shattered but never truly destroyed. The echo of Lila Grace would linger forever, not as a scream of injustice, but as a whisper of love, a gentle, persistent reminder of the girl with storm-gray eyes who had taught him how to see dragons in the ruins. The story was over, but her spirit, like the hummingbird on her necklace, was finally, irrevocably, free. And in that, Elias Thorne found a quiet, solitary peace. The kind of peace that comes after the storm has passed, and the world, though broken, is washed clean.